At my husband's funeral, my mother-in-law removed my name from the front row, moved my 8-year-old daughter and me 4 rows back, then announced from the pulpit that his company was returning to the Blood family. I stayed seated. Halfway through the service, our executor opened a buyout file and leaned toward me. "Did you authorize a sale to Pinnacle? I've never spoken to them." Before the final hymn began, the $180,000 deposit was frozen. I thought that ended it. Then the executor turned one page and showed me the payout schedule. My mother-in-law had not just tried to sell my company. She had assigned a price to my silence. My name is Rebecca Shaw, and at 36, I had already spent 8 years watching my mother-in-law turn my company into her son's legend. Before Harborlight, I worked in supply chain compliance for a hospital network outside Charlotte. I kept seeing the same problem-critical drugs, lab samples, transplant materials, and temperature-sensitive treatments were moving through systems designed for ordinary freight. So I built something better. I wrote the business plan, emptied my savings, guaranteed the first equipment loan, leased our original warehouse, and signed the contracts that kept us alive through the first 2 years. Miles joined 14 months later. He was brilliant at operations. He built our driver network, improved emergency routing, and created the kind of culture that made people answer their phones at 2 in the morning because they trusted him. I founded Harborlight. Miles helped make it strong enough to survive without me in every room. By the time he died, we employed 48 people, worked with 9 hospital systems and 3 pharmaceutical companies, and had recently been valued at $4.6 million. The ownership was never complicated. I held 78%. Miles held 12%. Our original investor, Nora Patel, owned the remaining 10%. Marjorie simply preferred a different story. At company galas, she introduced Miles as the founder and called me the paperwork side. She brought his sisters, Darlene and Colleen, to events as if they were heirs waiting for their turn. I corrected her once. She smiled and said, "People connect with the Shaw name." Miles hated conflict with his mother. I loved him enough to let small lies pass when the truth was safely recorded where it mattered, or so I believed. We had one daughter, Iris, who was 8 when Miles died. 10 months before his death, he updated his will, shareholder instructions, beneficiaries, and trust documents. Helen Graves, our longtime attorney, became independent executor. Miles's 12% would pass into a trust for Iris. I remained in control of Harborlight. Marjorie received no company role, voting authority, or access to corporate decisions. Miles even wrote Helen an email. "If anything happens to me, Rebecca remains in control. Mom has no role in Harborlight." I thought that sentence existed only to prevent family pressure. I did not know Marjorie still had a copy of an old power of attorney, and she was about to use my husband's death to make it look alive again. Miles died on a Tuesday night. Less than an hour after returning from a business trip, one moment he was standing in our kitchen, loosening his tie and asking Iris about school. The next, I was on the floor beside him while a dispatcher counted compressions through the phone. By midnight, I had become a widow. Iris had lost her father, and Harborlight still had temperature-controlled shipments moving between 3 hospitals. Grief did not pause the routes. I called our leadership team, told them Miles was gone, and asked Marcus Lee to keep operations steady. Then I sat beside Iris until sunrise and tried to explain something I still could not understand myself. Marjorie arrived the next morning and offered to manage the funeral. I let her choose flowers, coordinate relatives, and speak with the church because I had no strength left for seating charts and memorial programs. While I was signing death certificates and answering questions from frightened employees, she began assembling a different kind of document. 4 years earlier, Miles had undergone shoulder surgery and given Marjorie a limited power of attorney for a few months. It allowed her to collect mail, handle personal bills, and speak with his insurance company. It never authorized her to sell stock. It never gave her authority over Harborlight. Miles had revoked it after he recovered, and even if he had not, it ended when he died. Marjorie still had a copy, 2 days after his death. She sent it to Pinnacle Med Freight Group, one of our larger competitors. She told them Miles had wanted to sell Harborlight, that I was emotionally incapable of participating, and that the Shaw family controlled the company. She accepted an offer of $3.4 million, Our most recent valuation was 4.6. The lower price bought speed. Marjorie demanded a 21-day closing, an advisory payment for herself, consulting fees for Darlene and Colleen, and $300,000 for a Miles Shaw legacy foundation she intended to control. Pinnacle placed $180,000 into escrow while its lawyers waited for final corporate documents. Marjorie texted Darlene, "Once the funeral is over. Rebecca will be too exhausted to fight a signed deal." Colleen replied, "And if the deposit is already in, she cannot undo it without looking unstable." The day before the funeral, Nora Patel received an email welcoming her to the approved transition. She read 3 lines, saw my name missing from the consent page, and forwarded everything to Helen. By then, Marjorie had already printed the funeral program announcing who would carry Miles's legacy forward. At 8:45 Friday morning, I arrived at the church holding Iris's hand. The front pew had reserved cards for Marjorie, Darlene, Colleen, Darlene's husband, and 2 of Miles's aunts. My name and Iris's were in the 4th row. The funeral director looked embarrassed when I asked why. He showed me an email from Colleen requesting immediate Shaw family seating. "His wife and daughter are immediate family," I said. Colleen crossed her arms. Mom thought this arrangement was more appropriate. Marjorie stepped closer, dressed in black and already surrounded by relatives. "This is not the time for an argument." "Rebecca." I looked at Miles's casket, then at Iris. I would not turn his funeral into a public fight. So we sat 4 rows back. Iris leaned against me and whispered, "Why aren't we sitting where Dad can see us?" I had no answer that would not make her grief heavier. When Marjorie reached the pulpit, she called Miles the founder and heart of Harborlight. She spoke about his leadership, his sacrifice, and the family name he had carried with pride. Then her tribute became an announcement. "Harborlight is returning to the family who raised him," she said. "Rebecca needs time away from the company to care for Iris. Darlene and Colleen will help guide the next chapter of Miles's legacy." Several Harborlight employees turned toward me. Marcus, seated near the aisle, gave me one sharp look. He understood immediately. This was not grief speaking carelessly. Marjorie was preparing an audience for a transfer of power. At 10:02, Helen's phone vibrated. She opened an email marked "Urgent Final Estate Consent Required." I watched her expression change as she scrolled. The attachments included a draft purchase agreement, the escrow receipt, Miles's expired power of attorney, a false ownership schedule, and a document titled "Shaw Family Consent and Transition Agreement." Then Helen reached the payout page. Marjorie would receive $250,000 as a legacy advisor. Darlene would receive $90,000. Colleen would receive $75,000. Another $300,000 would fund a foundation controlled by Marjorie. Iris's name appeared only in a marketing proposal. Helen leaned toward me. "Did you authorize a sale to Pinnacle? I have never spoken to Pinnacle." She stood and quietly left the sanctuary. At 10:09, she confirmed my 78% ownership with buyer counsel. At 10:17, she sent notices disputing Marjorie's authority and demanding preservation of every email, file, and recorded call. She attached the real cap table, Miles's will, the shareholder agreement, and proof that she, not Marjorie, was the executor. At 10:24, Pinnacle contacted the escrow company. At 10:31, the deposit was frozen. At 10:39, Pinnacle suspended the transaction. At 10:46, the final hymn began. Helen returned and placed her phone in my hand. "Transaction suspended. Escrow frozen pending ownership verification." I did not smile. I held Iris's hand and looked toward Miles's casket. Then another email appeared beneath the confirmation. Marjorie had written, "Once Miles is buried, Rebecca will have no choice but to accept what the family has already announced." And suddenly, I knew the seating chart had never been about grief. After the service, I did not confront Marjorie in front of the mourners. I walked Iris to the car, asked my closest friend to take her home, and returned to the church's family room with Helen. Marjorie was already there with Darlene and Colleen. Helen placed the buyout file on the table. Marjorie looked at me as if I had interrupted her plans. I was doing what Miles wanted. Helen opened her laptop and read from an email Miles had sent 10 months earlier. If anything happens to me, Rebecca remains in control. Mom has no role in Harborlight. Marjorie's face tightened. He changed his mind. Then show us, Helen said. There were no board minutes, sale instructions, draft agreements, valuation requests, messages to Pinnacle, or signatures from Miles authorizing a transaction. I looked at Marjorie. You moved his widow behind the family while trying to sell his widow's company. Harborlight was his legacy. His work mattered. It did not erase my ownership. You only own the paperwork because Miles never cared about percentages. Those papers are loans I guaranteed, contracts I signed, and 78% of the company I founded. Helen folded her hands. A mother's grief is not a shareholder vote. Marjorie slid the old power of attorney across the table. Helen barely glanced at it. This allowed you to collect mail and handle personal bills during his surgery. It never gave you authority over Harborlight. It was revoked. And even if it had not been, it ended when Miles died. Marjorie said nothing. Death ended the authority you once held. Helen continued. It did not create ownership. I turned to the payout page. $250,000 for Marjorie, $90,000 for Darlene, $75,000 for Colleen, $300,000 for a foundation Marjorie would control. Iris was mentioned only as the child whose photograph would appear in fundraising materials. You did not protect Miles's legacy, I said. You tried to monetize it before his funeral ended. Colleen shifted in her chair. Moving the seating cards was Mom's decision. You moved my name. She only gave you permission. Darlene said, We believed the company should stay with the Shaw family. The company was never returning to the family. It never left the woman who founded it. Pinnacle's attorneys withdrew the offer that afternoon. They released the exclusivity agreement, provided every email Marjorie had sent, agreed not to contact our hospital clients, and deleted the operating data they had received. The escrow company returned the full deposit to Pinnacle. I kept none of it. But their rushed due diligence had already cost money. Legal review, valuation work, escrow fees, and integration planning totaled $46,800. Marjorie had signed a personal warranty claiming she possessed authority to negotiate. That made the settlement hers. Helen and I spent the rest of the day securing Harborlight. We disabled Miles's credentials, changed bank approvals, notified the board, preserved his email account, and sent customers a short statement confirming there had been no sale and no ownership change. Miles's 12% transferred according to his estate plan into a trust for Iris, with a corporate trustee protecting her interests. Marjorie received formal notice prohibiting her from representing Harborlight, contacting employees on its behalf, or discussing transactions with our customers. She called it an attack on a grieving mother. I called it the boundary she had forced me to put in writing. Just before midnight, Marcus called. Marjorie had already scheduled an all-company meeting for Monday morning. The subject line read, Introduction of Interim Shaw Family Leadership. Darlene and Colleen were listed as the new executives. At 6:12 Monday morning, I canceled the meeting Marjorie had scheduled. Then I sent one message to every Harborlight employee. There had been no sale. Ownership had not changed. No member of the Shaw family held authority to hire, direct, or represent anyone inside the company. All operational decisions would continue through me, the board, and legal counsel. I did not mention the funeral. My employees were not an audience for my family's betrayal. At 8, I appointed Marcus Lee interim COO. He had worked beside Miles for 6 years, knew every route, and had earned the trust of the drivers and hospital teams. I was still CEO, but grief had already taught me that strength did not mean pretending I could carry every function alone. Marcus accepted without ceremony. I'll protect what you and Miles built, he said. Miles's 12% moved into the Miles Shaw Family Trust for Iris. A corporate trustee would manage the dividends, taxes, valuations, and voting instructions until she was old enough to understand what the shares meant. Helen asked whether I wanted to seek control of that 12%. No, I said. Those shares are Iris's connection to what her father built. They are not my reward for stopping his mother. Marjorie received no advisory payment. Darlene and Colleen received no consulting fees. The foundation was never created. Marjorie had to pay Pinnacle's $46,800 in legal, escrow, valuation, and planning costs. She also surrendered every copy of the power of attorney, the buyout records, and the laptop she had used to contact the buyer. She was barred from representing Harborlight, contacting our customers, or asking employees for company information. Darlene and Colleen turned over their messages and corrected the online obituary that had called Miles Harborlight's sole founder. They were no longer invited to company events. Marjorie said I was erasing the family from Miles's life. I answered, I am correcting the parts you rewrote. I did not completely remove her from Iris's life, but visits came with boundaries. Marjorie could not discuss the company, the trust, or inheritance with Iris. She could not tell her that I had taken Harborlight from her father. She could not use Iris's photograph in fundraising, contact the trustee, or bring her to media events. A relationship with Iris is not access to her shares. I told her. She called that punishment. I called it parenting. 6 months later, Harborlight opened a new coordination center. We named it the Miles Shaw Operations Center. The memorial plaque did not call him the sole founder. It read, in honor of the man who helped Harborlight deliver when every minute mattered. Iris placed a photograph of Miles in the dispatch room beside the team he had trained. I told the employees the truth. Miles had not built Harborlight alone, and neither had I, but he had made it stronger, kinder, and more dependable. His legacy was not a discounted sale. It was the people who still answered emergency calls because he had taught them why the work mattered. That evening, Marjorie texted me, I lost my son, and you took the rest of his legacy. I protected what he actually left his daughter, his shares, and the company we built together. You were never truly part of the Shaw family. I looked through the glass wall at Iris laughing with Marcus and 2 drivers who still told stories about her father. For the first time, Marjorie's definition of family felt completely irrelevant. I had never needed her permission to belong beside Miles, and I no longer needed her approval to protect what came after him. Marjorie's final message came later. Miles would be ashamed that you broke this family apart. The family broke when you used his funeral as a closing deadline. Darlene asked me to let it go because the sale had failed. A frozen transaction does not erase the people willing to profit from it. My boundaries remained no company role, no access to Iris's trust, and no using my daughter to rewrite what happened. Marjorie said blood should matter more. I did not need your bloodline to stand beside him. I was already there. She mistook my grief for consent. I never made that mistake again. Would you confront her at the funeral or wait, comment, and subscribe for more revenge stories?